So with that, I think it'd be really interesting to move over to Julio Berdegue, and Julio, hear a perspective from you about what you see as the big issues in Latin America, perhaps pointing out where you maybe see some differences with the African side. And I know just before we all came online, you were talking about the devastating impacts of COVID, which I think also sort of illustrates one of the things that we really need to be understanding. So we look forward to your input.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to meet with you and share ideas about the future of smallholder agriculture, or family farming, as we tend to call it in this region. When this painting was painted in 1948, 47 actually, by the Mexican painter Diego Rivera, the world had just ended World War II. FAO had been created only 2 years before. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, the rural population was around 60%, which is more or less the rate that we find today in sub-Saharan Africa. Agriculture was very much the central arena of livelihoods of most people. 62% of all Mexicans were food insecure. 89% of them lived in poverty, which probably meant that every peasant, every smallholder farmer was probably poor. However, these farmers were quite autonomous and independent, as they lived in local communities, quite isolated from the broader world, and their livelihood was certainly centered around agriculture, which of course was the dominant sector in the economy as a whole. A few years later to our present world, and food systems are very, very different from the world only 50 years ago or 70 years ago. Where is agriculture now? Where is the smallholder now in this very, very complex modern food system, which has spanned the whole world in different magnitudes, in different regions for sure, but always in the same trend, I believe. Now, there is a question whether smallholders have a future in this very, very different new world of food systems. Well, this is some data from Chile. Chile is probably one of the most liberalized economies in the developing world. Very open markets, very competitive, very little support. And yet we see that over the last several decades, smallholder families or family farmers have done relatively quite well in Chile, both in terms of numbers, of course, it's been decreasing as it's normal and natural, but at a slower rate than the decrease in the number of commercial farmers. Relative to their starting point, the income of smallholder farmers has increased at a much faster rate than the total income of commercial farmers, which in fact has tended to decrease. So this shows that in the Latin American context, smallholder farmers can do quite well or relatively well in this very new complex world of modern food systems. So there's always been a question, should we build bridges or should we build walls to protect smallholders from this, what appears to be a very menacing world out there? The question is, bridges to what? And the first comment I want to make, strong point I want to make, is that often we're building bridges to the wrong place, or not the wrong place, but places which are not the fundamental places for the majority of smallholder farmers. For example, we put a lot of attention to building bridges to agri-food processors and to supermarket chains and to niche markets. We've done a review of the corporate reports of the 27 largest agri-food processors in the world, who represent about 90% of all agri-food processing in the world, and the top 25 supermarket chains in the world, which represent essentially almost all supermarket chains sales in the world, food sales. Also, we've seen the reports of the organizations of organic farmers and fair trade farmers, and we find that taking all of these niche markets, specialized markets, they only serve a very, very tiny proportion of smallholders. We're, on the other hand, placing very little attention and very little support in improving the real markets, where most 98, almost 99% of the smallholder farmers of the world continue to operate. So we need to be sure that we're building bridges to the right places in order to support the vast majority of smallholder farmers. The future of family farmers in Latin America depends on the changes in the context in which they live and work. We tend to focus a lot, and it's correct to focus a lot, on building the capacities of smallholder farmers. But we don't do enough in improving the environments and expanding the environments in which these smallholder farmers live and work. And it's not enough to build the capacity of the smallholder if we don't improve the environment in which they live and work, because this environment can be very conducive or it can be very toxic, regardless of how much we invest in technology or finance, etc., in the smallholder, him or herself. So how can we improve this environment? Well, there's many ways, but I would like to prioritize 4 ways. First, we need to seriously advance digitalization. Perhaps this is the cheapest and most efficient way in which we can connect millions of smallholder farmers to a larger environment. Second, very traditional, but extremely effective, we need to continue to improve rural roads. Improved rural roads make a big difference, a huge difference in the life of smallholder farmers and their households. A smallholder farmer can link to the market using digital means, for sure, but the potatoes that he or she sells to that market still need to travel through an actual road. And in Peru, that increases by 14% the cost of his or her potatoes. So we need to improve rural roads. Third, as I said, we need to really make a big effort in improving the real markets in which the vast majority of smallholders operate. It's okay, niche markets, specialized markets, I have nothing against them. It's extremely very good, very useful for the about 2% of smallholder farmers in the world who link to those specialized markets. But we need to focus on the markets in which 98% of the smallholders in the world operate. And these are the traditional markets, and we've sort of forgotten about them. Finally, very, very important, we need to improve agency, the capacity of smallholders and rural peoples to change their local environments. This means improving local governance and investing in the development of coalitions of rural people and smallholders that can lead transformative change in the places where they live and work. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm 1 minute over the time you gave me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julio. Again, some really focused points on thinking about the future. I'm wondering if I could just ask you a couple of quick follow-up questions on that. I mean, one is coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, is how much of small-scale farmers' incomes are coming off the farm, and what does that mean in sort of a balanced policy to deal with that issue? Because I think we were talking about that in terms of the vulnerability of farmers from the COVID situation of losing external income. So how do you see the future of small-scale agriculture in more diversified livelihoods, and what does that mean for the way one needs to think about the issues you were just talking about? Oh, you're on mute,
Yeah.
Julio.
We know, and we've known for many, many years, that in all regions of the world, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, also in Asia, also in Africa, the share of the income of smallholders households that comes from non-farm sources is increasing. And in many of these regions, it's also more than half of the total income. Now, that doesn't mean that many of these smallholder farmers leave agriculture. I think that this non-farm rural income is part of the reason why in countries like Chile, they continue to survive, exist, and operate and do quite well. It's a combination of agriculture and non-agricultural income that gives them the resilience that they need. So I don't see there's any contradiction between the growth in non-farm income and the continued development of smallholder farmers.
Okay. And what I'm assuming in terms of you're saying about focusing on the real markets to which smallholders contribute, is you're seeing sort of informal, semi-formal markets remaining as a huge proportion of the food supply system in most parts of the world for a considerable period of time.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the case, you know, and yet, you know, we're spending a lot of money and giving a lot of attention to, you know, linking with the Unilevers and the Walmarts and the Tescos of the world, which is perfectly fine. I have no objection to that. But we need to do much more in the local markets, the village markets, the wholesale markets, these very complex network of markets, which is where the vast majority of smallholder farmers work. We've forgotten about that. It's a very, very difficult challenge, but it's absolutely essential.